Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a red setter in Graphite. Now this video is going to focus on how to draw realistic fur and how to capture different fur textures with how we need to adjust the pencil technique. Now before I start with the fur, I always like to begin with the eyes. This is where the main emotion and expression stems from, so I do want to be making sure that I've got all of that accurate before I look at any other part of the drawing. Now as I start to work on the fur, this is where I'm going to be using a range of graphite powder and my graphite pencils. Now when I work with graphite powder like this, I'm not trying to make this first layer as dark as the end drawing is going to be. This is purely just a blocking in process. This makes it a bit easier to follow that reference photo more accurately, and it's already helping to establish where all of the key structures are. Now this is something that I do focus all of the real-time tutorials on because the placement of the lights and the darks is just as important as the fur direction. Now the fur direction is not random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure, and that's exactly the same for the highlights and shadows. So as you can see here, as I'm building up my darker values, they are all in the key places where the structures are indicating at the shape of the skull. So you've got that darker section above the eye, that's where the eye socket should be. The area that I'm working on now is indicating where the cheekbone and the jaw is. So all of these structures, it's really important to make sure that we've got those accurate to the reference photo. Now when building up the fur direction, this is something that I do like to establish again fairly early on in the layering process, just so that I can follow that reference photo as accurately as possible. Now with all of that in mind, the pencil technique, the fur direction, the lights and the darks and so on, it can all become quite overwhelming. Now one of the ways that I like to overcome that is to work in smaller sections. And then I like to get a smaller area about 80% complete, and then I can move on to the next part. By the time I've then got those 2 or 3 sections done, it's therefore looking more like that reference photo earlier on in the drawing process. Now being able to visualise that whole section that I've then drawn and know that it looks like that animal, it's more motivating to me. So it just is a way that I can ensure that I always want to be back at the easel and I don't leave a portrait at that uglier stage. If I was to spend all of that time blocking in the base layer, I'm going to have a slower progression through that drawing before it starts to look realistic, just purely because the area is larger and it's demanding more of that time. If I break it up just working on the top of the head here, for example, if I decided to put the pencils down for the day, this already looks realistic. It's at that stage where I'm motivated to want to come back and draw more. Now, of course, this is all down to each individual artist. There's no right or wrong way of approaching a drawing, but if you do feel like you're hesitating, you're not quite sure where you should be, that is usually an indication that we're working on too much of a larger area. Just scaling it down into smaller sections can really help. Now drawing noses of any animal is one of the more challenging parts of a portrait because if something's not quite right, it's usually very noticeable even if someone doesn't have the reference photo. Now if the nostrils are too close together, they're not quite the right size for example, that's very obvious. So I want to be making sure to start with that I map in all of those key structures first. I know that I've got those right and then I can progress to mapping in my lights and my darks. But I do have a focus tutorial of a dog's nose here on YouTube, so I'll link that in the description below if that's of interest. Now when I came to blocking in the rest of the face, this is a larger area than I would typically work, but because the fur here is very soft in the lights and the darks, I needed to make sure that each section was well blended into the next. This makes it far easier to build in that softness as we start to put in those detailed layers. Now when drawing softer fur like this, where it is a little bit more sort of blended from one value to the next, I think it can be very easy to then end up with the highlights and shadows that gradually get pushed further and further to one side. Now in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, I'm again mapping in some of my key lights and darks first so that I can see exactly where I should be in that area of the reference photo. If I was to block all of this in for one layer at a time, I think that's when the lights and darks can get slowly shifted in where they should be regarding their placement. And something else that's really important is about just trusting the process in terms of that we shouldn't be expecting it to look highly realistic at those first layers. This is a gradual process where we're refining each of those layers that we add. So it's okay that initially it's not looking how we might want that finished portrait to be. Now, if there was more of an issue earlier on in the drawing process, if I felt like the proportions or the perspective was off and there were things that I needed to adjust, then I would recommend to make those changes at the time. Usually, adjusting the proportions is better to do when you first notice it, because otherwise everything else starts to be off as well. So let's say, for example, the eye placement. If we don't fix that, then it's going to affect where the lights and the darks are positioned around it. That then has a knock-on effect to where the bridge of the nose and the highlights and shadows there should be. So in terms of anything obvious, that's when I would make those changes. But in terms of the beginning layering process, it is okay that it doesn't look as realistic. It is about just building those layers up gradually in stages. Now onto the ears, and this is where the real-time tutorial really focused on how to adjust all of the techniques with the pencils and the erasers, the blending and softening tools to create that different fur texture. Now the fur on the ears is significantly longer and it overlaps and curves in different ways compared to the face. So I want to be making sure that I've adjusted my layering and pencil techniques accordingly to get that variation in the fur texture. Now when I start to use my graphite pencils and I come in with my erasers, this is where I'm focusing a little bit more on how the fur clumps together. So it's not as much about the individual details, it's about following the groupings of the fur in building up that depth and denser look to the fur texture. Now the way that I'm tackling this ear would be exactly the same if I was drawing a spaniel ear. The textures are almost identical. Now if you've got a spaniel ear, you would potentially have longer sections of fur, but this of course is going to depend on if the dog's been groomed and so on. But the way that I am actually building up the layering process would be the same. The only difference would be that those pencil strokes might need to be lengthened slightly. But here I'm focusing on the main lights and darks. I'm building up that texture in stages. I'm not trying to draw those finer details first. Now when working with graphite, I think some of the issues or the worry that can happen is if we make the layers too dark first, and that we can't then pull highlights back in over the top. But if we're using the right technique, we're using the right pressure through the pencil at each stage, the erasers can work really well to pull in those highlights back over the top. Now this is one aspect of all of my graphite drawings that I really focus thoroughly in the step-by-step real-time tutorials. I want to be making sure that I have covered as much of that technique process as possible, because being able to overlap those eraser details on top with confidence, knowing that we can make those layers of graphite very dark and still pull in highlights as I am here, can make a real difference to how we can capture that extra level of realism. Now this is why I like to record all of my real-time tutorials with a voiceover while I'm drawing. I'm able to explain all of those processes and techniques in the moment. Sometimes adjusting a technique is only very slight, but it makes a huge difference to the end result. Being able to explain all of that in the moment just means that the tutorials are far more step-by-step. There are no secrets, I don't leave anything out. Now on to the final part of this portrait, and I did begin by mapping in the collar. Now drawing in collars, this is optional, you don't have to do it, but in some cases it can add something to the portrait. But in some cases it can also be a distraction. So I think this does vary depending on the reference photo that we're working on. Now when I worked on this section of the fur, you can see from the finished photo of the drawing in the corner that the fur is significantly darker on the neck, and I really wanted to make sure to capture that. Now part of being able to capture the contrast is making sure that we know how to layer the graphite pencils to achieve those darker values. I want to be making sure that I've got some of those sections as dark as I can possibly get the graphite to go. And in order to do that, the layering process is really important. Now I decided to draw the collar first because this fur is longer and it does overlap the collar in certain sections. So being able to overlap that fur on top of the collar is just going to help with capturing that extra level of realism. Rather than drawing the fur first and then adding the collar, where the collar has to then be drawn around the clumps of fur, just makes it a lot more awkward. Now just like when I worked on the ears, the way that the fur is mapped in can really simplify the process. So this could definitely become very overwhelming, and we could sit there looking at the reference photo and think, I do not know where to start. That feeling is entirely normal, but knowing how to work through that and simplify the process can make a huge difference. Now at this stage here, this looks terrible. It doesn't look realistic. I'm really just focusing on the lights and the darks, but the details are almost just being drawn over. This is okay as long as we're using the right pencil technique. Now when I'm looking to build up my values and contrast, this is where taking those bold decisions to map in a base layer that's exceptionally dark can make a huge difference to how three-dimensional the finished portrait will look. Now, of course, there are many ways to get to the same end, so you could, if you wanted to, draw around your lighter sections of fur and then add in your darker values that way. I would just be recommending to make sure that you've still captured the softness so that the highlights don't look like they've been blocked in, because that's something that can happen if the lighter values have been drawn around. Now, as I continue to layer here, the fur direction starts to become a little bit confusing. The fur direction changes depending on the layer as we work up through the midtones. And this is something again that I focus thoroughly in the real-time tutorial. Knowing what layer to draw first can not only simplify the process, but adds so much extra depth to that section of the portrait. Drawing details too soon is one of the easiest things to do because sometimes the lighter highlights that are catching the very top surface of the fur, we want to be drawing those in first because they're what we notice first. But ideally we want to be leaving those last because we need to be drawing all of the fur that's closer to the skin first. Now with graphite, because of the potential of worrying about not getting the highlights bright enough, especially if they are very, very bright, then there are other ways that we can work around it. We can leave those lighter sections, sometimes just the white of the paper showing through. So we can adjust the techniques depending on the reference photo that we're working from. But if we are knowing that we can put in those highlights on top of those darker values effectively, then it just makes that drawing process that much easier. Now the very last part of any portrait is one of those times where we might potentially start to rush, and sometimes we don't even realise we're doing it. Now if I start to feel that my eyes are getting tired, or maybe I know that I'm starting to miss out on some of those layers, the techniques are getting a little bit sloppier, then I will actually put that drawing away for maybe even just half an hour or a day. Just something so that I can then rest my eyes and come back to it later on when I know that I'm not then going to rush. If I was to rush this very last section, it would bring down the entire portrait, which would be a real shame. So I've briefly mentioned in this video the importance of drawing the right layer at the right time, and when we start working on dog tags or the metal ring on the collar, this is also important. Now although this fur texture is longer, so some sections of the fur are going to be overlapping the metal, for the most part the metal is still visible. So here I'm allowing the white of the paper to show through, and then I'll come in with my erasers at times if I do accidentally add graphite where it shouldn't be. Now in terms of making metal look shiny, that is all in good contrast. So we need to have the highlights really bright and the shadows really dark. Even there where I darkened up the fur in between the centre of that metal ring, that immediately makes the lighter section appear even brighter. And that's because the contrasts are all being refined and corrected. I can darken it up now in stages if I need to, but allowing that white of the paper to show through first just means that we're always going to have those lovely bright highlights where needed. Now the very last section of any portrait I will always spend refining my contrast, those lights and darks, and add in the whiskers. The whiskers I do like to leave till the very end because they are overlapping everything else. But as I start to come in here with the darker pencils and refining that contrast, you'll start to see that this makes a huge difference. I'm only darkening up a few select areas, but this just helps to add a huge amount of extra shape, depth and form to this part of the dog. And this is also why I leave the whiskers till the very end, because all of these little alterations, they do make a big difference to the finished portrait. But if I was to add the whiskers in first, I'm then going to have to draw around them, which is far more time consuming, it's really fiddly and it gets a little bit stressful. So I always like to take that time, make those changes to the portrait where needed, and then add the whiskers at the end. So I really do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in following along to the real-time tutorial of this red setter, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.